So, I've got 5 cutting boards I'm making today, all different. We got this simple edge grain cherry board, a real classic. Then a quick one, just a face grain slab. After that, things get a little more complicated. We've got a classic end grain checkerboard, then a multi-species stripe board with a few different woods. And for the last one, we're going all out. A high complexity 3D end grain weave. You see these things all over the internet, and they look incredible. They sell for a lot of money too. But that's where you can get caught. I call it the labor trap. You see that high price tag and think you're going to make a killing, but you forget to count the hours. Sometimes, the most expensive, most complicated piece is the one that pays you the least. It's a trap a lot of makers fall into, chasing complexity instead of profit. So today, we're going to find out for real. We're going to put it to the test. Which one of these boards actually makes you the most money for your time in the shop? So I'm starting the stopwatch right now. Every minute I spend on these boards is getting logged. We're going to track everything. Materials, glue, sandpaper, finish, all of it. I'm using a fixed shop rate of $75 an hour to figure out what my time is worth. And we're basing the material costs on projected 2026 lumber prices. This is a real-world test. No shortcuts, no TV magic. We're going to break it all down and see which board is the real winner, not just in looks, but on the balance sheet. Let's get to work. All right, first up is the edge grain cherry board. This is the bread and butter for a lot of wood shops. It's simple, it's strong, and people love the look of cherry. I've got my rough lumber here, a nice piece of 8/4 stock. The first step is always the same, breaking it down. I'm heading over to the miter saw to get it to a manageable length. I'm not trying to be perfect here, just roughing it out. You can see there's a bit of a twist in this board, which is pretty common. That's what the joiner is for. I'm making a few passes to get one flat face, then one square edge. It's all about creating those reference surfaces. Once I have that flat face and square edge, it's over to the planer to get the opposite face parallel. Then it's the table saw's turn. I'm ripping the board into consistent strips, about 1.5 inches wide. This is where you see the first bit of material waste. The sawdust, the offcuts from the jointer, the blade kerf from the table saw. It all adds up. I'm trying to be efficient, nesting my cuts to get the most out of this piece of lumber. If you're making a whole batch of these, 10 or 20 at a time, this whole milling process becomes a real assembly line. You can fly through it. But for today, we're just doing one. Now that all my strips are milled to the same dimension, it's time for the first glue up. I'm arranging the strips on my parallel clamps, making sure the grain looks good. I like to alternate the growth rings to help keep the board stable and flat over time. A good, even coat of Tight Bond 3, clamp it down with just enough pressure, and that's it for now. The clock stops for the glue to dry. So far, the process is straightforward, but the time is already ticking up. Next up is the face grain slab. This one is all about speed. I found a really nice, wide piece of walnut for this. The beauty of a slab board is the minimal processing. You're not ripping it into a million little pieces and gluing it back together. You're showcasing the wood itself. The workflow here is much faster. I've already got the board, so the first step is just a quick check with my straight edge to see how flat it is. This piece is pretty good, so it won't need a ton of work on the jointer or with a router sled. I'm just giving it a few light passes on the jointer to flatten one face, then running it through the planer to get it to final thickness. Compared to the cherry board, we've skipped the entire table saw ripping process. That's a huge time saver right there. The material waste is also way lower. I'm basically just losing some sawdust and a few shavings, not the kerf from a dozen rips. This is a big advantage when you're thinking about your bottom line. Less waste means more of the expensive board you bought ends up in the final product. With the slab milled flat and to the right thickness, I can go straight to sanding. Or, in this case, I'll cut it to its final dimensions first on the miter saw and table saw. Then I can add a handle or a juice groove if I want. For this test, we're keeping it simple. The transition from raw lumber to a recognizable cutting board shape happens in a fraction of the time. We're pretty much ready for glue. Wait, there is no glue up. See? We just saved hours of drying time. This one's already pulling ahead on the clock. Now we're getting into it. The classic end grain checkerboard. This is where the labor starts to pile up. I'm using maple and walnut for that high contrast look. The process starts just like the edge grain board, milling the rough lumber down into perfectly square strips. But here's the twist. After the first glue up, which creates a striped panel, the work is just beginning. I have to wait for that glue to dry completely, because the next step puts a lot of stress on those joints. This downtime is dead time in the shop. Once the first panel is dry, it's back to the machines. I run the whole panel through the planer to get it flat and smooth on both sides. Then, I take it over to the table saw, and this is the critical part. I have to cross-cut the panel into new strips. Each new strip already has the checkerboard pattern built into it. This is a repetitive process, and you have to be precise. Every strip has to be exactly the same width as the strips you started with to get those perfect squares. The clock is really running now, and a lot of it is just setup and repeat cuts. Now for the second glue up. I take all these new cross-cut strips, flip every other one end for end to reveal the checkerboard pattern, and glue them all together again. This glue up is trickier. You're dealing with a lot more small pieces, and keeping everything aligned is a challenge. You need a lot of clamps. You can feel the returns starting to diminish here. We've done 2 full milling and glue up cycles, and we still don't have a finished board. We've basically doubled the labor of the edge grain board already, and we haven't even started sanding yet. For this board, we're making a chaos or multi-species stripe board. I've got a bunch of different woods here: maple, cherry, walnut, paddock, purple heart. It's a great way to use up smaller offcuts, but for this test, I'm starting from scratch. The first challenge is that all these different woods have different densities and properties. Some are harder, some are softer. When you run them through the planer and jointer, you have to pay close attention to get them all perfectly dimensioned. It's not as simple as running a single species. The physical effort starts to add up here. Milling 5 different types of wood means more trips back and forth between the lumber rack and the machines, more machine setup adjustments. Then comes the layout. I spend a good amount of time just arranging the strips, trying to create a pattern that looks good. You can't just throw them together. You have to think about color, contrast, and how the grain flows. This design phase is active labor, and it's time on the clock. It feels more creative, but from a business perspective, it's billable time. After the glue up, we move into finishing, and this is where overhead costs really start to show up. Sanding a board with multiple wood species can be tricky. The red dust from paddock can get into the grain of the lighter maple if you're not careful. You go through more sandpaper because some of these exotic woods are really hard and will clog up the discs faster. And then there's the finish itself. I'm using a food-safe mineral oil and beeswax blend. It's a consumable. It might not seem like much for one board, but when you track it, these costs eat into your margin. And now for the final boss, the 3D end grain weave. This is the board that gets all the likes on social media. It looks impossible. And honestly, making it feels kind of impossible sometimes. The process is incredibly complex. It involves multiple angled cuts, multiple precise glue-ups, and a ton of careful planning. You start by creating angled strips, gluing them into blocks, and then cutting those blocks again at another angle. Any tiny error in your angles gets magnified with every step. I'm using my digital angle gauge and setting up jigs for everything. The sheer amount of time spent on setup is staggering. For every cut on the table saw, I'm double-checking my jig, my blade angle, my fence position. The glue-ups are a nightmare. You're clamping together angled pieces that want to slide all over the place. I'm using tape, cawls, and every clamp I own just to hold things together while the glue sets. This board will have 3 separate, complex glue-up stages with hours of drying time in between each one. The active labor is intense, and the passive waiting time kills your shop's throughput. Finally, we get to finishing. Sanding an end grain board is already a chore, but sanding a 3D end grain board is a whole other level of pain. You have all these different angles and facets. You can't just run it through a drum sander. A lot of it has to be done by hand or with a random orbit sander, carefully working into every corner to get a smooth finish. I'm going through every grit from 80 all the way up to 320. The final shop time for this one board is going to be massive. It looks amazing, but I have a bad feeling about what the numbers are going to say. Okay, the work is done. All 5 boards are finished. So, what did we learn? Let's look at the numbers. I've put everything into a spreadsheet: material costs, based on 2026 prices, all my consumables, and most importantly, the total logged labor hours for each board. Then I compared that to their current market value. The results are interesting. The 3D weave board, the one that sells for the most money, took an insane amount of time. When you do the math, the hourly return was the lowest of all 5. We fell right into the labor trap. The board that came out on top, the Goldilocks design, was actually the simple edge grain cherry board. It had the best balance of everything. The material cost was reasonable, the build process was fast and repeatable, and it still sells for a good price. The profit margin was solid, but the key was the high hourly return. I could make 3 or 4 of these in the time it took to make that one 3D board, making my shop way more profitable. The face grain slab was a close second, a super fast build with a great hourly rate, but limited by the availability and cost of wide, beautiful lumber. So what's the takeaway? It's a challenge to every maker out there. You have to rethink how you price your work and what projects you take on. It's not about chasing the most complex design or the highest price tag. It's about understanding your true costs and maximizing your hourly income. True success in this business is about finding that sweet spot between craft and commerce, prioritizing throughput and healthy margins. Sometimes the simplest thing is the smartest thing. Now you know. Go make something.